a number of months ago, to talk about his book called Reinventing Collapse. And I would highly recommend you read this book, not because it's going to make you smile and happy, but because I think that he's onto something in terms of the patterns, the financial markets that we're seeing, the problems we're seeing in America in the financial markets. And as he's pointed out in the past, the financial markets are the first to go, and then other things start to decay and follow thereafter. So it is a matter of reading not for pleasure, but for preparedness. And so I just give you a little background before we start talking to Dmitry. He was born and grew up in Leningrad, but has lived in the United States since the mid-'70s. He was an eyewitness to the Soviet collapse over several extended visits to his Russian homeland between the late '80s and mid-'90s. He is an engineer who has contributed to fields as diverse as high-energy physics, and Internet security, as well as a leading peak oil theorist. He is the author of Reinventing Collapse, as I just said, The Soviet Example, and American Prospects. Welcome, Dmitry, again, to Turning Hard Times into Good Times.
Thank you, Jay. Great to be with you.
It's really good to have you. Now, I believe you live in Boston, is that right?
That's right.
And I noticed, I think, something you read or wrote recently in one of your essays, but the last time that you were on the show, we talked about the 4 stages of collapse that occurred in the Soviet Union. And for the sake of those who may not have heard you then, could you perhaps review that again for the benefit of our current listeners?
Well, actually, that's an essay that I published over 2 years ago, back when financial collapse was just getting started. Mm-hmm. And I called it 5 stages of collapse to basically go along with the theme of 5 stages of grief, the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross hierarchy of grief. And so I did something similar with collapse, which is basically financial, commercial, political, social, and cultural collapse. Mm-hmm. So what we're going through now is some financial collapse. It hasn't really run its course yet. And a touch of political collapse, I think, is starting to happen. Nobody knows how to get the right results anymore. There's a lot of confusion. Commerce seems to be grinding along, at least for the people who have money, although a lot of people are running out of money. A lot of people are maxed out already. Social and cultural collapse have reached a fairly advanced stage, I'm sorry to say, in the United States. Most people don't know who their neighbors are. There really isn't any sense of community or society outside of churches, synagogues, that sort of thing. Their cultural collapse is really how willing people are one-on-one to take care of each other, and that's at a pretty low level in the United States as well.
Now, I understand that, as you say, a similar pattern, so you see a similar pattern to what happened. People here, though, would argue that the Soviet Union was a command economy. Admittedly, my view is that we're moving away from free market capitalism to the extent it ever existed in the U.S. to begin with, but that we are moving in a very rapid pace towards a command economy here. Would you agree with that?
I don't think so. I don't think anybody's in charge of the U.S. economy. I think it's basically a kind of a dead man walking. Mm-hmm. It's a system that is too complex, too complicated to be changed. There are too many entrenched interests. Nobody controls. The problem is that power is too diffuse, so nobody really controls any sizable chunk of it. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, nobody really controls anything at the local level. It's too interdependent and too centralized because all the power is in the hands of these large corporations that have a presence throughout the country. So the end result is not really even a political deadlock. It's just a deadlock on every level. Nothing can really be changed. No new proposals can be made because they run afoul of some entrenched interest or other.
So do you see evolving some sort of anarchistic environment where there's no law and order? That is, where these various special groups without anybody in charge, it just sort of creates a chaos?
Well, there are a few trends. One is that sovereignty is being eroded in a number of ways. One is that the narco-mafia is taking over. Mm-hmm. There's no reason to think that Arizona police will be able to stand up to, people armed with AK-47s. Mm-hmm. the war on drugs has been lost and is now an invasion. So the narco cartels are basically going to be the new aristocracy in the United States in maybe a couple of decades.
Wow.
So that's one thing that's happening. The other thing that's happening, and that parallels what happened in the Soviet Union, is that Washington can no longer bail out the states. The problem is just too large, and the states are too far along in the direction of bankruptcy. There are too many investments that have been made that are just the wrong investment. Too many stranded assets, like highways, have been invested, for instance. And so when that happens, then the center doesn't hold politically, and some sort of political dissolution starts to happen, where I wouldn't be surprised if, again, in a few years, California starts conducting its own foreign policy with Japan and China, cutting Washington out. That is a perfectly reasonable thing to expect. California's finances would be very well shored up if they stopped delivering federal tax payments to Washington.
That's very interesting you say that, because we've had another guest on this show, Ellen Brown, an attorney who has talked about California creating its own currency, and I know there are some states that have actually started talking about that. So what you see is a decentralization, I guess, taking place, and a move towards more local government and away from centralization.
Well, in a lot of ways, government is superfluous. In a situation where you can get people to follow rules, where rules make sense, and people already have accepted behaviors to follow that are adaptive behaviors, then yes, you can have government. But if what the stage is being set for is a situation where nobody knows what's going on, what would work, all the adaptations are different everywhere, and so governments are very good at governing things they can identify. But if it's all murky, if it's all who you know and the government doesn't know who they are, then there's really no government involvement, no room for government involvement. So I see a lot of activity that would be described as black or gray economy becoming very mainstream, and the official economy dwindling to nothing in some areas. Very interesting.
Since you and I last spoke, the U.S. has had some economic recovery. As I recall, the last time we talked was the middle of 2009, perhaps, or thereabouts, and we were just starting to bounce off a little bit. In my view, this recovery has been largely artificial, induced by massive stimulus, and not really anything growing from the bottom up. I don't know if you'd agree with that, but are you still as sure that we're heading in the same direction as you were when we spoke maybe a year and a half ago or so?
Oh, absolutely. It's unmistakable. The interesting thing is that all of the stimulus money really has had more or less negative effect. It's a reasonable thing to expect that as you approach collapse, things that used to work before work in a positive direction before start to work in a negative direction. So each additional dollar of debt now produces a negative effect on GDP growth. So the more the government borrows and spends, the smaller the economy becomes as a result. Very interesting result. And of course, nobody in Washington is prepared to either accept or even admit that this is happening. They can't really countenance the idea that the levers that they've operated for so long are no longer attached to anything. And so this is becoming a bigger and bigger problem for them. It's just becoming a very, very big embarrassment.
Right.
But in terms of economic recovery, if you actually track consumer spending on durable goods, for instance, it's a good thing to look at, because it turns out to track overall economy pretty well, cutting out a lot of government manipulation. But discretionary durable goods spending has never recovered. It just went down and stayed down. And we would expect the same thing to happen to the overall economy as well. So I don't think there's any economic growth at all. I think the economy is shrinking 1 or 2% a year. I think it'll continue to do that, and eventually that will accelerate.
And notwithstanding the government's numbers, which suggest that we do have a slight growth in GDP, I guess. But denial, you talk about denial in a recent essay that I read that you wrote. A couple of weeks ago, we had Boston University economics professor Lawrence Kotlikoff on this show, and he pointed out that for all practical purposes, the United States is already bankrupt. Professor Kotlikoff noted that if you run a present value analysis of the obligations of the United States government, that is on its Social Security, Medicare, etc., that it comes out to something like $202 trillion compared to $9 trillion that the government is owning up to. So this is a form of denial, I guess, but you talked in your recent paper about denial. Could you talk perhaps a little bit about other forms of denial?
Well, it's an interesting point about bankruptcy because the Soviet Union really dissolved when it could no longer continue rolling over its debt.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing is probably going to happen to the United States. And right now everybody's talking about, well, the yield on the treasuries is low and, it's a flight to safety. But at some point there'll be a run on the treasuries, all the money will pile into commodities, and then we'll have a bout of hyperinflation. That's the U.S.
Well, the U.S. is certainly dependent on the saving countries, China and Japan and others. And the Chinese have made no bones about it. They're wanting to diversify out of the dollar and get into other things. They're taking their dollars and buying assets and real items overseas. They're buying mineral properties and energy properties and reserves and things like that. Where your country, your motherland is Russia. Where do you think Russia fits in all of this? And do you think that that Russia is really looking to become a rival power to the United States again?
I don't think Russia really cares about the United States at all.
Mm-hmm.
The Russians had an interest in the United States at some point, but they're far more interested in trading with China, in having cordial relationships with Europe and kind of dissolve the borders between the European Union and Russia. And they're far more interested in to the extent that they want to be like other nations. They would much rather be like France and Germany, than the United States. The United States is just, as far as Russia is concerned, a bit of a has-been, and not really that much of a threat. The U.S. has all these military bases for whatever reason nobody knows. But it doesn't really amount to much, and they're just an irritant as far as Russia is concerned. Arming Georgia, putting these useless radar installations that, in the Czech Republic that are supposed to detect non-existent Iranian missiles. That sort of thing. It's just a bunch of nonsense, and there's a bit of frustration also that, on the one hand, Obama said that he wants to do a reset, he wants improved relations with Russia after the incredible stupidity of George W. But it turns out later Putin recently said that Obama isn't really in control. He's more of a hostage in the White House than anything. And so there's no point in really talking to him because no matter what he says, same things happen that were happening before. It's just a kind of a zombie state that continues doing the same nonsensical things.
Well, this is interesting if Putin said that, because it would certainly fit with what another guest on this show, Daniel Esterlin, has talked about, author and probably the premier authority on the Bilderberg Group. And it also jives with what you said a little earlier in terms of who's in charge. No one's in charge except large corporate interests, perhaps, that are really dictating and pulling the strings of the president and the Congress, I suppose, right?
I don't think they're even pulling the strings. I think it's more of a direct threat. Do as we say, or you're dealing with just complete, total collapse.
Interesting. Well, you made several trips during the demise of the Soviet Union from 1989, I believe it was, through 1995. Could you perhaps talk about some of those trips and what you saw, how things sort of changed as things went downhill in the Soviet Union?
Well, I saw things change in a number of snapshots, which crystallized what was going on for me in a way that it wasn't obvious to the people who were there the entire time, and certainly not to the people who visited just once or twice. I was from there, so I knew what I was looking at, English, etc. The first time I went there, it was still the Soviet Union, very recognizably so, and the odd thing was that nobody thought that anything would ever change. That was the refrain. This is all going to just go on like this forever. And people were talking in terms of really marginal improvements, really small things. the next year after that, it was pretty much economy in free fall, shut down, empty stores. Nobody wanted to accept the Soviet currency for much of anything, gasoline shortages, and everybody trying to grow their own food. And then on subsequent visits, I saw various stages of the sort of mafia capitalism take over, where you could buy anything out of a locked metal booth run by some ethnic mafia. And there was a lot of crime, and the whole thing was just incredibly unsettled and dangerous. Then I caught snapshots of hyperinflation, where I was running around with my pockets bulging out with these rolls of useless 1,000-ruble notes that, to buy, a sack of potatoes, you needed a pile of money. And that went on for a while. And then I saw Russia very rapidly recover. Mostly this happened after I stopped coming to Russia in mid-90s. But I saw it starting to happen, where Russians got very, very busy. They basically decided that this has to change, and started making improvements, and they were quite successful in doing so. So that now Russia is really an unrecognizable place. Sky-high real estate prices, and very prosperous looking, very well-dressed people, new cars on the street. People taking vacations in tropical places during the wintertime, all that sort of thing. Trappings of the middle class for a large part of the population.
When was the last time you were back in Russia?
I was back there in 1996.
1996, yeah. And but do you have family members back there?
Yes, my wife is there now, as a matter of fact.
Oh, okay. So you were in constant contact with things in Russia on a regular basis then?
Oh, yeah, absolutely, yes.
Now, in a recent paper that you've written, you talked about, and let me ask you before I forget to ask you, how can people track your work? You have a blog or a website, I believe.
Yes, it's Club Orlov, ORLOV.blogspot.com. And it's a very popular blog. I get a lot of visitors.
Club Orlov. Could you say it one more time?
cluborlov.blogspot.com.
Okay, good. So you were, in a recent paper that you've written, you talked about the preparedness, or how people were able to handle this adversity in Russia, and you're suggesting in many ways that people in the United States probably won't be as prepared if it comes to that in the United States. Could you perhaps give us some examples of why you believe that's to be the case?
Well, it's actually coming into focus now that 60% of Americans are on public assistance. There's this 40% gap of Americans who aren't on public assistance, and they're going to be a problem, because in Russia, the reason people could survive relatively well is because they were 100% on public assistance. They all lived in public housing. They all used public transportation. Most of them were provided food by government-run stores, the food such as it was. And the extractive industries that delivered gasoline and diesel oil and coal and things like that were all government-owned and continued to function. They didn't really need any sort of a market economy. Mm-hmm. So financial collapse internationally didn't mean standstill within the country itself. The life support system didn't fall apart. Whereas here, the government can't really, do anything without spending money. So once that money stops being effective and internationally, once Americans have to start earning foreign currency in order to get what they need, which is 2/3 of the gasoline they burn, the economy will come to a standstill. This is a very big difference. Mm-hmm. Now, putting 60% of the U.S. population on the dole is kind of a step in the right direction, because then you can sort of commandeer the parts of the economy that keep people alive, and maybe keep things going that way in the absence of a market economy, once market failure really sets in. But we're very far from that point, and because everybody here is such a great believer in capitalism, much more so than the Russians were believers in communism, it's very unlikely that the necessary adaptations will be made.
Mm-hmm. So the decline then will come when the dollar, when we actually have to earn foreign currency rather than just issue our own and receive, the Chinese, the Japanese, others buying our debt. When that day ends, then I guess that's when things will fall apart, and you see really hyperinflation heading our way.
Well, yes, and I think that it's more or less an instantaneous effect. It's sort of like you can run up a big bill at a grocery store that gives you stuff on credit, but one day you'll show up and they'll tell you that your money is no good here.
You're right.
And ask you to leave. And so that will happen systemically. I don't know what will trigger it, but what I think will happen is at some point all of the people holding treasuries will get spooked and start piling money into commodities instead.
Mm-hmm.
And that will
as I noted, I mean the Chinese have certainly been hinting at that, and more than hinting, I think there's evidence now that they are buying fewer of our treasuries, and that is probably one of the reasons that Mr. Bernanke is doing quantitative easing, as they like to call it. I like to call it printing money. That we're buying the Federal Reserve buying the government's debt, or talking about buying everything under the sun if need be. I mean, Bernanke even talked about buying gold mines at some time in the future if need be to pump money into the system. And there's sort of belief that we can just sort of by printing money overcome all of these economic declines. I mean, it seems to my mother, who only had a sophomore in high school education, it seems preposterous. But the PhDs in economics, they're buying this story, aren't they? People are buying this story.
Well, there are two things to say about that. One is that the Chinese aren't going to whip the rug out from under the U.S. Treasury.
Right.
They're just not going to. They have a doctrine called the doctrine of small steps. So every month, more and more international transactions are conducted in yuan through Hong Kong. Mm-hmm. Less and less Treasury paper is being bought up, or more and more is being sold, as the case may be. Mm-hmm. They're reversing that, but it's gradual. Mm-hmm. They're not going to cause a panic. Mm-hmm. In fact, they don't want to cause a panic. So the cause of this collapse in confidence will be some event. We don't know what it's going to be, but there will be a trigger, and after that, it's sort of like just a house of cards collapsing. Mm-hmm. Now, what Bernanke is doing, you can call it printing money, but really it doesn't do anything because it doesn't actually produce any kind of spending. It doesn't increase the velocity of money. It's just basically a game with bank balance sheets where they get nominal dollars at one window, and then they deposit those nominal dollars at another window and earn interest in those same nominal dollars. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's just basically some kind of a paper game, but it doesn't really have anything to do with the economy. Mm-hmm. It only has to do with making institutions that are bankrupt look solvent. Mm-hmm. And I think the only end result of that is they have enough money to pay themselves salaries and bonuses, and enough money to contribute to political campaigns.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're certainly right when you say about the velocity of money. I mean, this is as I read about the events of the 1930s, the Great Depression in the U.S., it seems to me policy is following the same measures as it followed then. Only, but the banks wouldn't lend. They weren't people that were credit worthy. As you say, you show up at the grocery store one day and they don't want your money anymore and they tell you to leave. The consumers are losing their credit. You said they don't have money to spend anymore. That's absolutely true. Well, or I would say they don't have credit any longer. The credit lines have been cut because banks are looking and saying these people can't pay us back, and they're losing their jobs. Jobless rates are really, really high, notwithstanding how they try to whitewash it and say, oh, gee, we created more jobs this month than we expected, so therefore the stock market rises. There's an enormous amount of denial going on in the United States yet, though, isn't there?
Well, yes, and I think that it will continue up to the moment when people stop thinking that they don't have enough money and start realizing that they don't have enough of whatever this money can still buy and won't be able to for much longer.
We only have a minute left. I'd like you to tell our listeners what they can do in the next, if you can tell them in the next 60 seconds, what can our listeners do to prepare themselves for what might be coming our way?
Well, basically they have to make connections with their neighbors and with their families and start providing for themselves and for each other in various immediate direct ways so that they can prepare themselves for life without access to consumer goods or store-bought products. And that's a tall bill, I know, but, that's what we have to do.
Okay, well, for some more practical advice on that, then give our listeners your website again, your blog again, if you could just give that one more time.
Orlov, ORLOV, .blogspot.com.
Dmitry, I want to thank you so much for coming on with us again. We could go on for a long time. Realizing we had such a short period of time, I shortened the questions and the depth of those questions, but I want to thank you again for sharing your insights and your experience. For the Americans who are listening to this, a debt of gratitude to you for coming on and sharing your insights and helping us prepare for what I think is going to be a very difficult time ahead. So that's all the time we have for now, but